Good evening. On behalf of Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, I am honored to welcome you to this evening's program, Insurrectionist Threats to Our Democracy. As an institution grounded in the history and lessons of the Holocaust that works to share universal lessons of humanity and generate awareness and action against prejudice, bigotry, and injustice worldwide, this evening's event is not only timely, but continues to remind us of the importance of our work to fight hatred with education. I need only think of the late 1970s when survivors and policymakers and concerned citizens rose up against the hatred that attempted to evade Skokie, Illinois, who then went on to found an organization dedicated to fighting that hatred that was confronting them with education. With the continued rise of anti-Semitism, white supremacy, and racist rhetoric, such as the Great Replacement, which we'll learn more about this evening, and is taking hold in mainstream consciousness over the past several years, and will be discussed by the findings from the University of Chicago Security and Threats, or CPOST project, and discussed by our esteemed panelists. It truly paints an alarming picture. I must also say that I can only think of many of our beloved survivors, in particular our President Fritzie Fritschall of blessed memory, who as a survivor of Auschwitz in the weeks, even days after the January 6th insurrection, spoke very passionately and viscerally of how the hate-filled symbols, particularly the t-shirt of Camp Auschwitz, meant to her as a survivor and the impact that that had. For well over a decade, Illinois Holocaust Museum has used its special exhibitions, public and educational programming to engage our audiences through the lens of history and ways to help us teach, learn, and inspire, as well as help us look inward to grapple with the difficult narratives of the past and, as this evening, those of the present. A quick overview, run a show of this evening. We will first hear a presentation by Dr. Robert Pape, who I will introduce in a moment. That will be followed by what I know will be an absolutely thought-provoking and riveting conversation by our esteemed panelists. We also invite you as our audience, who I know are joining us across the country, to submit your questions in the Q&A box of your webinar screen. It is now my honor and distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Pape, who is the director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats and is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, specializing in international security affairs. He is a published author, and his commentary in international security policy has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, New Republic, Boston Globe, and LA Times. He can also have been seen on Nightline, ABC News, NBC News, CNN, Fox, and NPR. Dr. Pape.
Yes, just a minute, waiting to, Kelly, can I share the screen, please? Yep, just waiting to be able to share the screen. Kelly, could you let me share the screen?
Robert, you're a co-host now.
Thank you so much. There we go. Excellent. Thank you so much. To avoid a repeat of the January 6th assault on the Capitol and similar attacks, we need a fine-grained diagnosis of the scope and drivers of the insurrectionist movement to develop an effective risk assessment of political violence in the 2022 midterm and 2024 US presidential elections. Today, I will present the findings of two studies to help with this diagnosis. The first is a study of the 604 individuals arrested as of September 1st for assaulting the Capitol on January 6th. This is based on a systematic examination of thousands of court and other documents by our research teams at CPOST. And our goal is to identify demographics and home characteristics of the insurrectionists. The second is a 1,070 person nationally representative survey to help us understand the national scope and drivers of the insurrectionist movement. Let's start with study 1 and see who was arrested for assaulting the Capitol. Their economic profile is striking. Over half are business owners, CEOs, and from white-collar occupations such as doctors, lawyers, and architects. Only 7% are unemployed, almost the national average at the time. In my 30 years studying political violence, I can say this economic profile is very different than the usual profile of far-right or other extremists. The last time America saw middle-class whites broadly involved in collective political violence was the expansion of the second KKK in the 1920s. Another important feature is that despite their prominence in the media, only a small number were members of militia groups like the Oath Keepers or extremist groups like the Proud Boys. In fact, nearly 90% were not affiliated with any of those militias. Overall, what we are seeing is not the fringe of America, but the fringe spreading into the mainstream of America. Normal pro-Trump activists joined with the far right to form a new kind of violent mass movement. Now let's see where they came from and why. As you can see, the 604 came from 44 states. Large pools came from New York and California, some of our bluest states. None came from some of the reddest parts of the country in the Midwest. We drilled down further and examined counties. Over half of the January 6th insurrectionists came from counties that Biden won. Many came from large urban Democratic strongholds like Dallas, Houston, Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, all of which Biden, of course, won easily. What's special about the counties with the insurrectionists? We found that the more rural the county, the less likely was the county to have had an insurrectionist. We found the more the county voted for Trump, the less likely was the county to have insurrectionists. The number one feature of the county, aside from simply the size of the population, was the loss of non-Hispanic white population. The more the county lost white population, the higher the rate of having an insurrectionist. For every 1% decline in the white population, the number of expected insurrectionists increased by 25%. This would happen by chance less than 1 in 1,000 times. Now, why would someone from a community losing white population become an insurrectionist on January 6th? Increasingly, some politicians and people in the media tell whites that they are being replaced by minorities and destined to become second-class citizens in the United States. This is called the Great Replacement. White decline in one's community can reinforce and seemingly confirm these political and media narratives. Now, to find out if that's right, we conducted a nationally representative survey to assess whether the fear of the Great Replacement corresponds to insurrectionist sentiments in the general population. We used the gold standard of surveys, a nationally representative sample fielded by the highly respected NORC at the University of Chicago, because this allows us to extrapolate our findings to the general population. This slide shows the answer to the question, do you agree that Joe Biden stole the 2020 election and is an illegitimate president? As you can see, The equivalent of 65 million adults agree with this, more strongly agreeing, 41 million, then somewhat agreeing, 24 million, and a sizable 47 million not sure. We also asked, do you agree the use of force is justified to restore Donald Trump to the presidency? As you can see, the equivalent of 23 million adults agree with this, with more strongly agreeing, 13 million, than somewhat agreeing, 10 million, and a sizable portion of the general population unsure. This slide shows how many people hold both of these extreme beliefs. We see that 8% of American adults, which equates to 21 million people, agree both that Biden is illegitimate and force is justified to restore Trump to the presidency. Now, this is important. A key indicator of long-term domestic violence in a country is the pool of the population that sees political violence against an illegitimate government as justified. In fact, the legitimacy of a state's government is a key factor in our military field manuals about when to expect domestic political violence against a government. Now, to be sure, our survey has a margin of error. It's 4%. This means that the insurrectionist movement could be as small as 12 million or as large as 30 million with 95% confidence that it's in that range. The 21 million is the best number because it's right in the middle of that range. However, even at the low end, the numbers are worrisome. The 21 million are already dangerous. 1 million either personally know a militia member or are militia members themselves. 6 million support militias like the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys and are right recruiting grounds for extremist groups. 7 million own guns. 3 million have prior US military service and so have lethal skills. All have easy access to internet tools for rapid organization. Now, to be clear, the 20 not now violent. However, the 21 million are a large mass movement that sees our current government as illegitimate and that using force to restore Trump to the presidency is justified. They are like a mass of dry brush. They need a political trigger to ignite, but what's worrisome is the size of the mass. Where do they live? As you can see, more than 70% live in metropolitan areas. This dovetails with our first study, which found that most insurrectionists live in urban areas where they are a political minority, not in rural, the reddest parts of America. What beliefs are driving the 21 million? Two mainly. The biggest is the Great Replacement. The idea that the rights of whites and the rights of blacks and Hispanics are overtaking the rights of whites. The second is the QAnon cult belief. The idea that a secret group of satanic worshiping pedophiles is ruling the US government. We did look at other drivers, such as the fear of losing their jobs or belief in the end times. But these other economic and religious factors don't come close to the Great Replacement and the QAnon cult idea as drivers of the movement. For time's sake, I'm skipping over our regression results, but these are available. So what do our two studies tell us about the movement? It is a broad mass movement with violence at its core. It is a political movement, not ordinary criminal behavior, although crimes may be committed. Members are a political minority in many places, not only centered in the red parts of the country, and both studies find evidence of the fear of the Great Replacement as a key driver. Going forward, we urgently need more nationally representative surveys all the way through November 2022. We need surveys assessing the vulnerability of the military to recruitment by militia groups. We need a network of independent experts to build findings into viable policies. And we need support and commitment from the White House to accelerate understanding and response. And I should say that in early November, I do have a meeting at the White House on these findings. We need to act now because the 2022 election season is coming. Before I finish, I would like to thank the Illinois Holocaust Museum for hosting this important event. I would like to thank Rick Solomon for his outstanding organization and leadership. And I would like to especially thank Senator Blumenthal and Congressman Jolly for their gracious participation. And of course, all of you for joining this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Really appreciate your presentation. So now I know many of you that are with us this evening have heard the expression from strength to strength. And that's how I would absolutely describe the incredible team that we have assembled this evening. First to join us is Senator Richard Blumenthal. He is serving his second term as United States Senator for the state of Connecticut. He currently serves on the U.S. Senate Committee on Veteran Affairs, Committee on the Judiciary, Committee on Armed Services, and the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Senator Blumenthal was one of the principal sponsors of the 2021 No Hate Crimes Act. Former Congressman David Jolly served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2014 to 2017. A student of the institution, Jolly has held virtually every position in Congress and has worked outside Congress as an attorney and consultant. Today, Jolly can often be seen as an analyst on CNN and MSNBC, where I watch him in the morning. Jolly's work has been published in Time, Roll Call, The Washington Post, and Washington Times, and currently serves as executive chairman of the Serve America movement. And last but absolutely not least, our incredible moderator, Richard Solomon. Rick is involved in a number of philanthropic and social service related activities. He is a co-founder and member of the executive committee and vice president of our board of directors for the Illinois Holocaust Museum, a member of the advisory board for the Visas for Life Foundation. In addition, he is on the board of NYU's of Many Institute, as well as the President's Council for the Interfaith Youth Corps. Rick is a frequent public speaker at the 92nd Y, Temple Emmanuel, and many, many others. I am proud to call him a friend. Rick, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you, Professor Pape, for a very thought-provoking presentation. Let me just say the views of the museum run across the entire political spectrum. So why don't we start with you, Congressman Jolly, as a former Republican, now independent. Your top of the mind reactions to the presentation, if you may.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. And let me nearly complete all the thank yous to everybody involved who's attending and who has pulled this together, and certainly to Senator Blumenthal, someone who whose legacy will be richly remembered and for many years still to come will be enshrined based on his work on gun control. Senator, thank you very much for that. Rick, I think it's important, you know, and I appreciate you saying that the political views here are very diverse, because they should be, in confronting an issue that is in some ways could be considered an existential issue for Americans, for America's future, but also for our culture and for our American identity. It's hard to overlook the motivating factors presented in that in that report, but I think I would seize on a few things. First, to lay context, I would say this. In the 2020 national election for president of the United States, we did not have a peaceful transition of power, right? We seize on the strength, the American medal that does define our democracy. Democracy won on January 6th. It won again on January 20th. But the reality is, for the first time probably since the Civil War, the United States did not experience a peaceful transition of power. And if we overlook and ignore this inflection point that we're living through right now, then we also ignore the call to action to push back on and defeat the forces that created the violence that almost led to the overturning of an election. The second reaction would be to the size. I think it's very important that the study that Professor Pape shows is the extrapolation of the numbers. What does that mean for the size of the American community, for our fellow countrymen and countrywomen who actually believe that the current presidency is illegitimate and that also force is justified? That is a significant demographic now within the United States that we have to decide how we will respond to. And then I think the final moment and our final takeaway, and I was able to have this conversation with the professor during a pre-call. These people didn't just emerge on January 5th and decide to do this on January 6th. What lit the Kindle? What was the igniting moment? And it's clear that that moment was a political voice. And, you know, I suppose when I pay tribute to Senator Blumenthal earlier on his work on guns, completely unrelated perhaps to these other issues, I would say it's an example of how there is a public trust that we give over to our elected leaders. And those elected leaders either use that public trust for good for all society, or it can be a very powerful force for bad. And I think what we saw, leaving out any partisan affiliations, were political voices willing to ignite and amplify the insurrectionist moment that led to January 6th. And that probably is the greatest danger of all. A political voice, a voice of leadership, or multiple voices of leadership that actually affirm and give permission to the toppling of a democracy. That is why the fact that this was a moment where we did not see a peaceful transition of power is something that should give us all pause and also be a call to action.
Well said, and welcome Senator Blumenthal, fresh off your chairing on national television, the Facebook whistleblower hearings today, which also got into January 6th. Senator, if I may, your reaction.
Thank you so much, Rick. And let me begin by thanking you for your commitment to the values, really the values which are so paramount and important, especially in these days, and to this really thoughtful mission that we have tonight. You've brought us together, and it's a really distinguished group. Professor Pape, thanks for that incisive and insightful presentation. And I particularly want to thank David Jolly because, you know, in a sense, what we are mourning or grieving here is the loss of people like David Jolly in our politics. His decision to stop running for office, and he's still very much involved, but not in office, is a great loss to this country. He was a Republican and represented the kind of Republican that I loved, even though I'm a Democrat. Thoughtful and public-spirited, willing to take decisions based on the merits, courageous, as he was a lot of time and still is. And I would say that where Professor Pape's presentation goes is the loss of that kind of leadership. And I think, as difficult as maybe to measure in a poll, in those communities where those individuals came from, I'm willing to bet there were not the kind of political leaders that you have in David Jolly, who could, in a sense, bring people together, explain in accessible ways what the national debt is, what the trends are in employment, So I think that's an important point here. Second, relevant to today's hearing, the power of social media in encouraging and weaponizing and amplifying this violent right-wing extremism and white supremacy is not to be underestimated. And if you look at today's hearing, a lot of it was about the role of Facebook, but you could apply it to Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, bringing together that group on January 6th. So even though they came from certain places, they have certain backgrounds, social media helped to bring them together. And third, I would just emphasize again the point that Professor Pape made. And in this connection, I just want to give a shout out to a book that I'm in the middle of reading. It's called Wildland by Evan Osnos, and I mentioned it to Professor Pape, which makes exactly the analogy he did. Because wildland is actually the term that's used by forest fire fighters, those guys who jump into the middle of forest fires, to refer to areas of timber that are dry and ripe for forest fires. And his thesis is essentially that this moment in our history has been building over the last 2 decades, literally 2 decades, and he goes back that far to show how the timber was there for Donald Trump to ignite. And of course, it was born of declining areas of our country. He chooses West Virginia and certain areas of West Virginia to cite for the declining economy, but also the threats to the environment resulting from strip mining and the decline in quality of life. And he goes to Chicago and I must say, for better or worse, to Greenwich, Connecticut, and the rogue financial cheaters who made tons of money in hedge funds and so demeaned the value of work, the dignity of hard work, manufacturing, because they were getting away with financial murder. So, you know, it really is a complex phenomenon, but we need to deal with it because, and I'll just finish on this note, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, our intelligence community put out reports, and I'll just quote one of them very recently. The most persistent and lethal threat to our internal security is white supremacy and violent extremism. Now, it used to be foreign terrorism. We're talking now about domestic terrorism. This is a real and present threat. White supremacists are not only racially motivated, they are religiously motivated. We're talking serious anti-Semitism, anti-Muslimism. This is a cancer that is metastasizing in our society. And I really want to thank you for calling attention to it. We can't talk about it too often or too much. And again, thanks for this very thoughtful evening.
All incisive comments, Senator, and indeed bringing it back to home to the mission and purpose and raison d'etre of our museum. In fact, Professor Pape, and I'm going to come to you now, follows you so closely, Senator, that he actually, I think, has read, he told me, almost all of Evan Osnos' book since we spoke to you last week. So let me come to you, Professor. Let me ask you, versus the 2 studies, what are, in your view, the biggest surprises? Was it the 21 million willing to use force and noting an illegitimate government, the 44 states, including blue states that were part of your determination, the diminution in whites in various counties? What surprised you the most?
I'll definitely appreciate that, but I would like to just assure the senator, and also, so you know, Clarksburg, West Virginia is a big part of it. That is among the highest counties in the country in the loss of white population. It's one of the areas, so I don't want to take away from the audience here, sir, but I just do want to assure you, I didn't just read it here. Our research teams have started to analyze it, and I'm just is #1 case for what we're talking about. So anyway, but back to your question, what was surprising? Well, actually, a number of these findings were extremely surprising. So first, let me talk about the size. Before this, I spent a lot of time studying the impact of ISIS Western-directed propaganda in the United States. I've worked with our FBI. I've worked with our National Counterterrorism Center since 2015. We've studied all the prosecutions of ISIS perpetrators in the United States. So this is something we know quite a bit about. We also do surveys, and you can't get 21 million Americans to say they support in any way anything like that's just not happening with ISIS. In fact, we had to kind of work for years to find a question people would even start to say there's a little bit of support. So this is extremely concerning. So the fact that we have what equates to 21 million here, and of course, people know this may be shy. We may be dealing with a shy population, not so this is something we have a lot of representation, a lot of experience with, and the 21 million, even 10 million, I mean, this is just far greater. And we've now done several surveys, by the way, that are pointing in this over 12 million, and this is just really very concerning. The second is, so I teach at the University of Chicago. I am steeped in economics drives violence. This is what Gary Becker, Gary Becker, one of our most famous economists in the world, that's what he got his started in the early 90s. I am extremely familiar with this argument, and I've got plenty of colleagues surrounding me with this view all over. So the fact that it wasn't economics driving this, that it was the Great Replacement, it's not that I was unaware of the Great Replacement. So I can't say that, but I really come from a world and environment, an intellectual environment, not predisposed to see things as economically driven, and that's not what it is. So anyway, but the point I'd finally like to just keep re-emphasizing is, as important as the past is in analogies and understanding how we got here, it's really important to treat this like COVID. We need to do testing, the equivalent of testing in the general population, which means surveys. And these are voluntary. People don't have to fill them out. There's nothing required here, but it is really the case that we need to do we need to use our tools of social science to understand the here and now and going forward. And that's something that we just haven't been doing with this problem, I'm sorry to say.
Interesting. Before I turn to Congressman Jolly on the Great Replacement theory, one other quick question, Professor. In your first study dealing with the faces of the January 6th insurrection, there were no foreign actors involved, as you determined?
So we go through all the court records using the same process we did in our study of ISIS perpetrators in the United States. And we worked with the FBI on this, including in Chicago and at HQ. And so we are pretty familiar with how to not just read the court documents, but sometimes read what might not be in the court documents. And the fact is, we see no indication here that January 6th, the folks who are arrested are coming from foreigners or Antifa. This is just simply not borne out by anything like the facts. And we have voluminous detailed information now on those 604, some more than others to be sure, but this is really quite voluminous. The FBI is to be commended for the amount of detail they didn't just collect, but they put into the public record, which they don't always do. And I can speak from experience, having gone through the same thing with ISIS perpetrators.
Congressman, your reaction, and also the senator, to the Great Replacement theory and what these findings bespeak.
Yeah, Rick, this is so critically important, and as far as I'm concerned, for this program tonight, there's one thing, if you have one takeaway, it's around this issue, because there is a nuance in political speech now that has created a generational pivot among Republican-leaning leaders and voters, and it's this. And it speaks to Great Replacement theory. It also creates to what ignited the 1/6 insurrection. Historically, even today, the mainstream of major parties approach their constituency with a question of whether or not you are being treated fairly, right? On everything from marginal tax rate to equality of opportunity to creating ladders of opportunity in education and workforce and healthcare. It's all a matter of equities and are you being treated fairly? Even Republicans engaged in that, for the most part, mainstream Republicans over recent generations. Here's the pivot that's so critically important and critically dangerous. Republicans have moved from, some Republican leaders, I should say, I don't want to paint a broad brush, from are you being treated fairly to a premise that something is being taken away from you, right? And what ignites the human spirit to fight is something's being taken away from me. My culture is being taken away from me. My opportunities are being taken away from me. My kids are not going to have the opportunities that I had. Those are being stolen from me. That's the great replacement theory when it comes to immigration and communities of color and constituencies from overseas who wish to come experience American freedom. But it also is true of domestic politics as well. We have a certain political class that's willing to conflate policy issues with demographic issues and point to demographic trends and say, it's not that you're not being treated fairly, it's that things are being taken from you. And I suppose the silver lining to this, something that I was taught by a colleague of mine on NBC, many of you probably know Professor Eddie Glaude of Princeton, he really brought me up to speed and educated me on the fact that creating equality is not a zero-sum game, right? To provide greater justice to George Floyd does not require reducing justice to me and my white family that lives a fairly privileged life. And that's an important notion, and that's a fairness conversation. But the notion that you share with some constituencies that you're being taken from, that ignites the fight. And the brilliance of political leaders that can then light that spark is to say, you have to go to the Capitol with strength, not with weakness, because if you don't, you're going to lose something. It's not a zero-sum game.
Fine. Senator, your reaction and thoughts on what this portends for the future?
Well, the intelligence community is fond of saying the best intelligence is predictive, because you want to avoid catastrophes like a 9/11, and you want to avoid racial and ethnic conflict. But I do want to go back a little bit in history to put it in perspective. My dad came to this country in 1935. He came to escape persecution, the Holocaust, in Germany. He was, at the time, 18 years old. He came alone. He spoke no English. He knew virtually no one. And he had not much more than the shirt on his back. And this country gave him a chance to succeed. He would have been turned away, sent back under Donald Trump. I think immigration has always been controversial in this country. No Irish need apply, no Italians. I come from a state where the best they could do was work on the railroads. They were subject to discrimination on the basis of religion. They were Catholic by a largely Protestant old line state. Every ethnic group has made the same kind of settlement here. And now we face, in my view, very excitingly, a new influx of Afghan allies who love this country. After all, they put their lives on the line for us in Afghanistan, where they went into combat, some of them for our troops, but they put their families at risk. And they will provide more intelligence, energy. We're a nation of immigrants. At the same time, and here's where we, I think, come to Professor Pape's presentation. They are always viewed as a threat, and there is always discrimination against them. And when we talk about replacement theory, one of the most prominent times in the last few years that I've heard it invoked publicly was in Charlottesville. You remember those folks carrying swastikas? The Jews will not replace us. Replacement theory in a sense, called by different names, I think has run through our history. Now, that's not to say it's acceptable. Just on the contrary, it is the dark underside of our country. And it's something that we need to address in as thoughtful and effective way as we can. And now it obviously has racial overtones because immigration is no longer from Europe, it's from other parts of the world where people of color are coming to this country with the same kind of energy and talent and ultimately patriotism that other immigrant groups had. But I would just suggest, and I'm coming back to social media, just having been through a day of it, that one of the dangers here is that those sentiments which have been common to our country are amplified and weaponized. It's like pouring accelerant on a fire. Social media pours gasoline on the fire of racial bigotry, xenophobia, that underside in our country. And that's why I think social media has a responsibility in this day and age. I'm not offering solutions here, greater transparency, oversight board, a lot of these solutions came up today, but it goes to the fundamental core of our country, the fabric that holds us together, because it is helping to drive us apart. And it unites those violent extremists, the white supremacists. Again, I want to come back to anti-Semitism, which is unfortunately still alive and well in this country, as is all the other bigotries and prejudices, anti-Muslim, anti-Black, anti-gay, LGBTQ. You know, we need to be aware. One of the ways to secure ourselves against this, call it a virus, call it a cancer, is to be aware of it and to stand up in the way that Congressman Jolly has done, and the way everybody on this call has done in your private lives, including Professor Pape and Rick. You have been such a leader in this area. But I guess I'm just coming back to thanking the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center for facing a really tough subject in a thoughtful way, because that's a step in the right direction.
Well, social media is certainly a key part of it. The Charlottesville incident indeed is coming to trial in less than 3 weeks with the neo-Nazi groups on trial in Virginia. You mentioned history, so let me touch on something and see your reaction, because our museum, one of its many missions is remember the past, transform the future. I'm reminded of the potential risk here of what we're experiencing of a Weimar moment, the beer putsch of November 1923 and attempting to overthrow the Weimar Republic in Germany. You had the presence of right-wing paramilitary groups like the Freikorps and Das Stahlheim, which led to civil and democratic norms being eroded. And you also have here now far-right groups in the United States, including but not limited to the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, who've grown in number and ferocity. You know, I'm not saying there's a parallel, but does that concern you? Let me just go around the panel. Congressman, Professor, and the Senator.
Yeah, Rick, absolutely. And I think that's the importance of this conversation. And look, the Department of Justice is doing remarkable work with the prosecution of people who participated in the 1/6 insurrection. Really remarkable, hard, detailed work. And I would say there are several identifiable coalitions, but what they did was they mobilized people that otherwise wouldn't have been mobilized. And I think that's the most important thing to realize, is the opportunity to mobilize that number that Professor Pape showed is really ready for this message. And I think to the point of your question, Rick, if we were to ask everybody in attendance tonight, even though the Department of Justice has done such a noble job in bringing people to prosecution, do you think the fire, the embers of the insurrectionist sympathies throughout the United States are any less tonight than they were on January 6th? I don't think they are. In fact, I think there's a case to be made that they're even greater. And that's our calling right now. That's the point of this discussion.
I think that
Absolutely.
there's a tremendous amount here to be learned, following on what David Jolly just said, from history. I myself have been through the Holocaust Museum in Israel, and it's very clear, as well as others, of course, but it's very clear to see the power of what we could dismiss as mere rhetoric in changing ideas about what's legitimate and what's acceptable and what's justifiable in society. And it goes even beyond that case. Milosevic, so picking up on David Jolly's point about going from fairness to taken from, Slobodan Milosevic in his speeches in the late 1980s gave speeches about how Muslims in Kosovo were taking from Serbs their rightful place in government, language, values. Now, in the late 80s, there wasn't any major violence to speak of. A few years later, there was tremendous amount of violence, and people wondered, how could that happen so quick? It's because Milosevic planted a lot of those seeds. I would also like to say that another place that we're seeing is not just where history is continuing, but where it's different. And that's where I think Senator Blumenthal is calling attention to social media. Things I couldn't present here, we found that there may be multiple ways that the media is having an effect. Senator is right, there is clearly a discrete effect on social media, but we're also finding that perhaps those social media narratives are now bleeding into the mainstream, and people in the 21 million who've never been on social media are getting a lot of ideas from the mainstream. So there could be multiple ways we're seeing the metastasis of this problem from the fringe into the mainstream. And this starts, as I think David Jolly said, with the idea of shifting from fairness to taken from. That's very, very important that we see the shift that's happening in our politics.
Senator?
Let me strike a somewhat optimistic note, because
We can use that.
we all want to sleep tonight. I think a lot of these issues come back to leadership. If you have a president who looks at Charlottesville, the swastika carrying, epithet yelling crowd on the one hand, and the protesters who are there in favor of non-discrimination and tolerance on the other, and says they're good people on both sides, that's the kind of moral equivalence that I think Professor Pape was alluding to. That's why the hatred and the bigotry can seep into the mainstream press and be given a kind of equivalence. You know, this one said that, and the other says this, and, you know, we're going to play it straight down the middle, anti-Semitism versus what someone else said. That moral equivalence, I think, is a great danger, just as the seeping into our mainstream talk. I just came back from a trip in early September to Lebanon and Israel, and anybody who travels abroad is reminded of the anti-Semitism and ethnic conflict that are so common around the world, that frequently involve bloodshed, murder, torture. And fortunately, we're, you know, as much as we're talking about the threat these days, and it is a threat, leadership, good leadership, and I know we're not going to be partisan here, and it shouldn't be a partisan issue, as we all know, but leadership, I think, can help bring us together and heal us. And obviously, there's no minimizing the threat of white supremacy and violent extremism. And we need to know more. And the kind of study that Professor Pape has done is a step in enlightening us and informing us. But I really think we have it in us as a nation to come together and conquer this dark underside.
One can only hope, and we need to clearly and actively work on it. Before getting to a few reforms that I get your views on, let me just touch on something that several of you raised: domestic terrorism. On January 6th, you had 604, I believe it is, people charged thus far. They've been arrested on trespass, damage to property, weapons violations, conspiracy. But many say there ought to be a domestic terrorism law. Any reaction, Senator, and also Congressman Jolly?
I wouldn't oppose it in principle, but I think it'll be hard to write consistent with the First Amendment. And I think there are other kinds of laws that get at the same problem. And I would want it to be drafted in a way that it goes after conduct, not speech. As much as we may abhor the Nazi rhetoric and so forth, the First Amendment has been held to protect speech as long as it doesn't invite physical conflict, as long as it doesn't involve fighting words and, you know, the proverbial yelling fire in a crowded theater. I think, having been a prosecutor, by the way, I was United States Attorney in Connecticut for 4.5 years, and then I was Attorney General in our state for 20. I think there are other tools that we can use.
Congressman?
Yeah, I largely agree with the senator. I would say the area to look at is around enhanced penalties, right? What the enhanced penalties we apply to hate crimes or to attacks on the disabled or law enforcement officers, or it is being considered for enhanced penalties. I think if you look at the prosecution of 1/6 insurrectionists, there hasn't been a lack of statutes to bring them to account on. And to the senator's point, if you go too far, you end up with laws like you see Florida Governor Ron DeSantis trying to implement, which does ultimately quell political speech. So look, I think more dollars on enforcement, and ultimately the senator knows this far better than anybody on this call, including myself, the resources for our domestic intelligence agencies to root out the underbelly of what are these domestic terrorism tendencies and threads, if you will, is probably most important. Our statutes are very strong, but I think any enhancement of penalties that would disincentivize the behavior we've witnessed certainly would be effective.
I think, by the way, if I can just interject out of order, I think Congressman Jolly just made a really, really important point about enforcement resources, which I'm remiss in failing to mention. I'm so glad you did. And the law that you mentioned earlier, Rick, No Hate Act, that we succeeded in passing during just this session, just several months ago, the president signed it. It's great, great bipartisan achievement. Actually provides for more resources to combat hate, obviously racial, ethnic hate, all of these kinds of phenomena, and better intelligence sharing, better training for police and other law enforcement, a call-in line, so to speak, a hotline for reports, because a lot of people are reluctant to report. They're ashamed or fearful. So I think there are laws that we can enhance. And I think the enhanced penalty, which, by the way, this law also provides, Congressman Jolly is absolutely right on that point.
Well, your leadership also in bringing together people on both sides of the aisle, Senator, was critical in getting the No Hate Act passed and signed by President Biden. So let us go on briefly to talk a little about other potential reforms. As Professor Pape has indicated, there are future flashpoints. Whether you call it what happened on January 6th, an attempted coup or not, it may rear its ugly head again. And the earliest flashpoint are the midterms in 2022. So you've mentioned, Senator, social media and the reform of that, whether it's the 230 immunity or other steps. what else, Congressman and Senator, and also Professor Pape, should we be looking at?
Yeah.
Increased voter inclusion, transparency, and I'll throw out one other idea before letting you react, if I may, and that is, as Professor Larry Tribe, my good friend, brought to my attention today, there are no less than 26 states in the 2022 election that are holding elections of their own for secretaries of state of the respective states. And that is a cause for concern too. So let's start with you, Congressman Jolly. What kind of reforms do you see beyond what the senator has already articulated?
Well, look, I think we're seeing the battle over election integrity, election security, and fundamental voting rights protection play out in states. That's a whole nother Zoom call, if you will. And I think most of us will be sympathetic to the same cause here, which is voting should be as accessible and free as it can be secure. And we're unfortunately seeing many states go the wrong direction in that. But here's what I think, what I'm most concerned about playing out in 2022, and it goes to how political leaders use their voices. The undermining of very fundamental guardrails in American political culture, but in our society over the last 4 years, is what has given a permission structure to then ultimately topple the results of those systems. And what I mean by that is, when political leadership is successful in undermining the very basics of elections, of a free and fair media, of a free and fair judiciary, when political leaders choose to convince a large swath of the country, a large constituency, that those are no longer legitimate institutions, well, then the acts of January 6th are permissible, right? They're not permissible if our political leaders on all sides of the aisle of every political persuasion agree to a certain set of guardrails and norms, that our elections are free and fair, that our judiciary is free and fair, that the media can be trusted. If we agree to play within that arena, then the actions of 1/6 are not permissible and hopefully don't occur because there's no affirmation structure to them. My fear is the American political culture, as a result of voices of political leadership, has brought us to a point in 2022 where there are no rules, right? The fact that however the election turns out, it's okay to undermine that election, either through changing the laws in states that take away the votes of people, through election of administrative offices that oversee elections that ultimately declare them or decertify those elections, or that a constituency can rise up and act with violence to overturn them. All that is now fair. And to go back to Professor Pape's very fundamental premise at the beginning, the difference in this scenario are the lone political voices that have risen to national leadership. And I used these words before, but I'll use them again. That is tonight our calling, is to confront and defeat those voices going into 2022.
Well said, Senator, and then Professor.
Yeah, thank you.
Great question, Rick. And I want to bring this conversation home a little bit because I stood on the floor today as one of the leading introducers, one of the original co-sponsors of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We introduced it today. Senator Leahy, Senator Warnock of Georgia, Leahy is from Vermont, and none other than Dick Durbin of Illinois. In fact, I followed him on the floor, the four of us taking the floor to introduce the bill. And I mention it because obviously we come from different parts of the country, but I think across the country, as Congressman Jolly just mentioned, you have voter suppression, repression of rights as a real and urgent danger going into 2022 and beyond 2024. In 2022, one of the great threats is redistricting that could make our Congress even less representative than it is now. And I don't want to get into the politics, but the point is that all of these laws that restrict polling places, the numbers and the hours they're open, early balloting, mail-in balloting, and of course the gerrymandering and redistricting that they provide. They are a great threat to our democracy. And I would just emphasize the point that the congressman just made. What keeps me up at night is waking up on the morning after the election in 2024 and having commissions appointed by the legislature or some state official, in effect, throwing out the election in that state and saying, as I am authorized to do by a recent act of the legislature, I will hereby declare all of the electoral votes of my state will go to fill in the blank. In other words, override the will of voters. It might be a close election, but it might not be. I am going to authorize all the electoral votes of this state because I think there was fraud here. And
that is a huge concern, no question. Did I interrupt you, Senator, before I go to Professor Pape?
you interrupted me at exactly the right point.
Professor, any comment before we get to audience questions on reforms that you think are key beyond those already well articulated?
Well, I guess I would say a couple of points of action, if not reform, since I'm not a political leader. Obviously, I think we do need more political leaders like Senator Blumenthal and former Congressman Jolly. These, you can tell just how important that is. What I would say is that we have a little over 6 months before those elections start to happen in the primaries. And we know that some of those primaries are going to be particularly important as we go forward. And what do we do with that 6 months or 8 months? I think that it's very important to have education, transparency, and part of that is with our elected officials already. And that's partly what's happening tonight about the continuing insurrectionist sentiments in our country. We should not take for granted people know this information, and also bringing this to the general public. That way, we can have a real conversation heading toward what Congressman Jolly was saying about how legitimate do we really think violence is to settle election disputes. And I think that this is going to be valuable because I am optimistic. I believe that overwhelmingly, when this really would come up for real conversation here, people are just gonna, no, that's not really where, and so I think this is likely to be extremely beneficial. But in order to have those national conversations about our values when we disagree on elections, we need more transparency about what's happening with the insurrectionist sentiments across the body politic. If we don't know that they're spreading and they're significant, then why bother with the conversation? I think this was the key problem before January 6th. This was the missing link about why it was such a big surprise. And I think we can do a lot in the next 6 to 8 months to make a real start on that national conversation.
Hey, Rick, can I jump in here with just one point, because this would not be a fair conversation without touching on this. I think the concurrence among the panelists and hopefully those who have joined is, look, the debate over rational political issues should be expected, and we're a healthier democracy before it. The danger is in elevating political voices that throw us beyond the guardrails, delegitimize institutions, and justify extraordinary measures and ultimately the violence we saw on January 6th. In terms of a reform, there's a political reform required of us as a nation that does come down to political parties. And I really want to be an analyst here, not judgmental, but we've got to take a snapshot in time and say the Democratic Party has not elevated people who are tearing down the norms of democracy, right? We might have opposition to some of the debate we're currently seeing over how far progressive or how far to the middle should the Democratic Party go. That's all fair. But we do have one of the two major parties that has elevated voices that have given this permission structure. And the only reason I bring it up tonight is not to indict the party, although I left it for reasons related to that. It's a reform that I don't know what the answer is, right? How does the Republican Party, as one of two major parties going into 22 and 24, break out of this and elevate a voice that could be hard right conservative, but plays within the rules and the norms of our democratic republic in a way that respects the rule of law? That's not where today's Republican Party is, and that's not a problem for which the solution lies in a reform or a constitutional move. I say that to lay the problem bare, but this conversation wouldn't be fair without acknowledging that problem.
Important to be noted. So let me get to some audience questions, and there really are quite a few. Let me first go to, there's a question here about the white replacement theory and how Tucker Carlson ranted on Fox about it. But the general question is really more to cover the waterfront. What has been the media's response to the great replacement theory? Any comment, Senator or Congressman or Professor Pape, to this question?
I haven't heard the rant. What and when, I have to confess, I'm not a.
Well, I'm not a regular watcher of Tucker Carlson, but I think the audience person was referencing that he doesn't, he, doesn't either believe the theory has water or it doesn't.
Well, I know a fair bit about this, okay, about Tucker Carlson's point. So what happened, Senator, is that in the spring, Tucker Carlson came out and full-throatedly endorsed the great replacement theory. He has since gone to overseas, to Eastern Europe. He has been doing this for months and months. It's not on every single one of his shows, but he is saying that not just there's a debate about maybe there's a replacement of whites occurring. He's saying it's an actual fact. And he's saying it is a conscious plan by a cabal inside of government, and not just the Democrats, to make this happen. So he is articulating quite a few of these beliefs that sometimes are said are just in the social media. He's articulating them for millions and millions in the mainstream, and he's not holding back very much.
Any reaction from either of you?
Rick, I would say culture wars reap enormous benefits for right-leaning politicians, and they reap enormous profits for right-leaning opinion journalists. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
I think that's true, although I haven't seen the program. It sounds to me like it's probably not worth much more in comment.
Sure.
But it is, it simply illustrates the seriousness of the threat.
Indeed. Two quick questions for you, Professor Pape. Are there studies that either contradict your report thus far, and someone who's a professor and researcher would like to know how he could get access to your data and report?
So interestingly, I'm not a polling agency, so I am a scholar. I don't do polling for a living. Right. And so we first came out with some of these findings actually in early July, because it was really hard to get these into the news, by the way. And it's really surprising, but what has happened since is you're starting to see The Economist, U.gov, others increasingly picking up some of our questions, issues of, is Biden illegitimate? I think that this is showing, as Mr. Jolly is saying, that it may be getting worse, not better, as time goes on. And so I think to the extent we have other serious polls here, they seem to be validating what we have been saying. So I think that this is just all the more to say that we do political violence. So I'm not in American politics. I don't do the horse race. What is important now is to put this in a political violence framework. That's what I do and scholars like me do, and that's what we bring to the table.
Excellent. And I'm sure after today, people will be able to get more access to the studies that you
Our
have
website,
done.
all over the website, many pages and slides.
So there's an important question here for the two politicians, excellent politicians on the panel, and it goes to something that I meant to ask earlier. I don't know if we're living in a post-truth world, but we do have the whole issue of how how Facebook spreads hate and how do you manage all of this? The question by the audience member is, how do you manage something like QAnon? The claims are so outrageous, yet they seemingly, as Professor Pape indicates, take hold. Congressman, Senator, your reaction, if you would.
I'll defer to the senator first on this, certainly.
I think we just need to fight it with truth, try to be as open and outspoken as possible, stand up to it. Again, we're dealing with many notions that have absolutely no connection to reality, and it's hard to fight myth, but we need to fight the falsehoods wherever and whenever they occur.
And any comment, Congressman, on the issue of whether we're in a post-truth world?
I think we absolutely are. And I think the concern is the mainstreaming of that behavioral element. Look, I thank you for describing the senator and myself as excellent politicians. I would point out he's still in office, I'm not. So he's figured out something that I haven't in this. But what I would tell you, my wife and I often have a conversation now that I live in this independent space where, look, I notionally we each get to call balls and strikes. Sometimes that's informed by our partisan affiliation, sometimes not. I live in this area where I kind of enjoy calling balls and strikes, but even in areas of facts, of truth, my wife and I, even today, driving down the road about a congressional race in Florida where somebody perjured themselves on the stand, a candidate perjured themselves on the stand. The voters will never really know or care about that, and this candidate will ultimately get the nomination. We often look at each other and say, nothing matters anymore. Nothing matters anymore. And that's a cultural question for us, right? I mean, honestly, I think there's a campaign finance reform route to that solution. The ability to spend money to create messaging that obliterates the truth that we put in front of voters on the second Tuesday in November. Or I guess first Tuesday, whatever the date is. Again, maybe why I'm not in office. But I appreciate the question about being in post-truth America, because I think we are, and it's not one that the reforms just sit in a very specific place, right? They're not statutory reforms or constitutional. They're probably more cultural than others, but we also have to then look at the framework of elections and campaigns and leadership that's been put in front of us and ask, how do we break through reforms in that space so that truth can emerge?
Senator, any further comment before I go to our last question?
Rick, I have time for a very quick last question. I have a meeting on the debt ceiling. We have a vote on the debt ceiling tomorrow, as you may know, and I have a meeting that I am late to get to. It began at 8.
Oh, you're nice to do this, so we're going to end on this question, which is, as you did earlier, you provided some optimism. The question goes to, how do we change, and you partly, all of you address this, how do you change hearts and minds so that we can bring our country together and stop the warring red and blue enclaves? You first, Senator, since you have to leave, please, and thank you again.
Good people being engaged and involved. I think there's no substitute for participation. As the old saying goes, democracy is not a spectator sport. And I think one of the most important things I do is to involve and engage young people. I spend a lot of time on our intern program because, just to tell you a little story, I began in politics as a young aide to Senator Abe Ribicoff of Connecticut. I don't want to date myself, but at the end of my service with him as his administrative assistant, which used to be the chief of staff, I had just been a Supreme Court clerk to a justice. I thought maybe I wanted to stay in Washington. I clerked for Harry Blackmun, and I decided I really want to go home to Connecticut. And so I went to him for our last meeting, and I said, Senator Ribicoff, what do you think your most important accomplishment is? I was really curious. And I thought he would talk about some bill that was passed into law, or maybe some, great other national achievement. And he said, the most important thing I do is to involve young people. He said, because after all, people are not really going to remember most of these bills that I sponsor or co-sponsor, even when I go to the White House for the signing ceremony. And he'd been the author of many famous bills, but he said, and he didn't say, you're one of my accomplishments, but he said, just to engage young people in wanting to be involved in public service, and whatever our level of public office or community service, being involved in the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, to get people to want to serve. And there's so many daunting reasons not to want to be involved these days. But, the people on this call have decided they want to be involved. And I just think that is so important, and particularly young people. Maybe I should say, some of the people on this call, I'm sure, are young people. But that's the legacy that we leave. That's what he meant, I think, is, and I've still run into many of my former colleagues in his office who are doing really good things in their communities and important things, and he had an impact on their lives. So, I think that's a way we impact the world and leave a legacy.
Great story, and thank you for your outstanding yeoman service. The debt issue needs you, and I will, feel free to tune off, and thank you. And let me go to Congressman Jolly for your last comments. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you to the Senator. I would say, as I started by saying, it's important to remember that we did not have a peaceful transition of power. It is also important to remember that democracy held that day, in part because of a brief, almost temporary wake-up call from some senators who had prepared to vote to not certify the election, chose to, because they saw that the threat of insurrection is very real. But the democracy held. And Rick, in large part, democracy held because the voices of Americans expressed concern in that moment. Senators, elected officials felt the voices, felt the heartbeat of enough Americans to say we have to protect democracy. And I think that's probably also the charge, that whatever voice you have, whatever chorus you belong to, picture a world in which that voice or that chorus fell silent. As an independent, I'm engaged in a lot of uphill historic fights where the chance of winning is very slim. But I often say, if we don't take on this fight, we lose. That's true in the reform community, as I mentioned, around campaign finance, around election reforms. If we withdraw from the fight, we lose. And so I think the silver lining, the optimistic part, is democracy held on 1/6 because enough voices participated. And the calling is to not let those voices fall quiet, because that's how we protect our democracy in 22 and 24.
Critical observation, and I for one hope you continue to stay in the arena as you so effectively have done.
Thank you.
Last comment before I turn it back to Kelly by you, Professor Pape.
I'm incredibly optimistic as a result of tonight. I can't thank you, Rick, and the Holocaust Museum and the Senator and Congressman Jolly enough, because I believe in our democracy. I believe knowledge helps our democracy. And I believe what we've done tonight is carry that forward. And I think this is just incredibly valuable. And I believe that as a result of tonight, we will become stronger. And I am just incredibly, not just grateful, but optimistic. And I truly believe our democracy will stand, but I worry it will be tested. And our knowledge will be one of the big advantages we have in those tests.
Well said. Here, here. And let me just say thank you to our outstanding panel and presenter, all of you. And let me turn it back to our Master of Ceremonies, our Vice President of Exhibitions and Education, Kelly Zaney. Thank you all.
Thank you, Rick and Bob and David and Senator Blumenthal. This has been an absolutely fantastic program, and I'm just, again, honored and privileged that our museum could be part of this conversation. I truly hope, Bob, that your study and findings get wide distribution, as well as I hope the conversation we had this evening. I want to thank everybody so much for joining us tonight. I do want to remind you of two of our upcoming programs. On October 14th, we'll be hosting a program on confronting anti-AAPI hate with Representative Jennifer Gong Gershowitz, as well as a special interview and remarks with Senator Tammy Duckworth. And then encourage everyone to please look out and attend our October 17th opening of our next special exhibition, which is Rise Up, Stonewall, and the LGBTQ rights movement. So again, our museum wants to be part of the conversation. As Rick said at the beginning, our tagline is remember the past, transform the future. And I hope that's what we can do with the conversations we had tonight. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you all.